Okay, let's get going. Let's get started.
I'll be here.
What?
It was these.
Yeah. Actually, have your lunch. I don't care. So we're starting off on memory today.
Oh my gosh.
Christmas break's over. I'm looking at you, Hunter.
I was paying attention.
Christmas break's over. Sorry. I wish it was not.
It's going to be canceled.
Maybe tomorrow. Maybe we'll get enough snow tomorrow. So we're finished through the motherboard, the CPU, and we're on to memory, which is the first real component that we add to our computer. And it's also, like everything else, determined by the form factor of our motherboard. So today, we're going to start with our goal of understanding memory. And we're going to start out with a history lesson, kind of, because you have to understand the evolution of memory to kind of understand the idea of the form factor when it comes to memory. And it's really the same thing as CPUs evolved, and we got different CPUs. They supported different RAM, and so we needed to have an evolution of RAM. So there's two kinds of RAM in our computer. We have static RAM and we have dynamic RAM. Okay? Dynamic RAM is dynamic in that it's refreshed all the time, thousands of times a second. It says every few milliseconds. It's continually getting rewritten. Because of that, because it's continuing to be rewritten, it's not as fast as static RAM. Static RAM, you write to and it stays there until you erase or write again. Okay. The memory controller controls how often this is refreshed. And can you guess where this RAM is versus this RAM, if you had to, before I go to the next slide? Okay, we have both in our computer. One place is refreshed all the time, and one place is just written to and only refreshed when it's needs to be rewritten. Okay, and we have them both in our computer right now. First of all, what are the two kinds of RAM we have in our computer?
RAM or wrong?
Two kinds of RAM we have in our computer.
Static dynamic.
Okay, yes. Okay, the two places we have RAM in our computer. What's one of them? Name one kind of RAM we have in our computer.
I'm not saying
One that's related directly to the last chapter test we took.
secondary
Okay, what did you say? We both said different answers and they were both right. Okay, what did you say, Jesse?
Also, primary and temporary.
Okay, somebody said it. Who said what? That's what she said. What did you say?
I said like in the memory sticks, like when you put them. Well,
That's not what you
where,
said.
so-
Okay, so that's one of them. Maybe I didn't hear where it came from. So one of them is the sticks of RAM that go in our motherboard. That's one of the places we have RAM, right? And we have two kind. No, you said something. Okay, maybe you did. Okay, so that's one of them. The sticks of RAM, and that's one of the places our CPU uses RAM. Where's the other place the CPU uses RAM? It's the other RAM. The cache, right? Okay, so we have two places. Didn't you say cache?
She said cash,
You
and I
cache.
said.
Okay, I heard you backwards. Anyway, so we have two places we have RAM that our CPU uses. We have the CPU cache, and we have the sticks of RAM that we put in our motherboard. Okay, and both of them represent one or the other. Okay, so which one do you think would be the faster one that is in our computer, and which one would be the slower one, if you had to guess? Cache is what?
Faster.
Cache is faster, so which one do you think is cache? Static, okay. Cache is static, and our sticks of RAM are dynamic. And the reason for that is that static RAM is really more expensive.
Can you go back a second? It's like for a quick second, let me just read
For a
it.
quick second, okay. So, dynamic RAM needs to be refreshed. It's not as fast, but it's cheaper. Static RAM is faster and more expensive than dynamic RAM. Made differently, I don't know the physics of it, but it is, okay? So static RAM is what our cache RAM is, and dynamic RAM is what our system sticks of RAM that we put down on our motherboard are, okay? So the difference is that static RAM is faster, more expensive, but it doesn't need to be refreshed, and dynamic are those sticks of RAM that need to be refreshed all the time, and they're cheaper. Okay, so that being said, we've already learned almost all we need to know about cache. You just needed to know that it's static, okay, but we already know what L1, L2, and L3 cache are. We can't change it out. It's not really the point of this chapter. That's why we talked about it back with the CPU, because you buy it with CPU. It's not like you can add it later, okay? The point of this chapter is system RAM, which now we know is dynamic RAM, that's cheaper and a little bit slower, but we can take it out and we can put it in our computer, okay? So, we already know these things, what L1 and L2 and L3 cache is. Does anybody have any question on that? Going back a whole 2 weeks. We didn't lose everything from our brain, okay? But that's static. We know where L1, L2, and L3 are. We know that we get that with the CPU, and it makes our CPU perform better because the more cache we have, the less it has to go out through the system board to that slower dynamic RAM that we're talking about in this chapter, okay? So, there's different types of memory. And it's all determined, why is that little box in there? Don't know. There we go. It's all determined by the motherboard. The motherboard form factor determines what kind of RAM we can put on it, okay? So when we go to that motherboard, this chapter is about understanding this part down here, those specifications that we've just read the number, but there's more to it than just the basic number of what works in what, okay? So that's really what we're getting to this chapter. So RAM, dynamic RAM, went through a number of evolutions to get to what we are today, okay? I have a bunch of sticks of these. They make nice keychains from the old kind of RAM. And eventually the dynamic RAM evolved into what's called SDRAM, or Synchronous Dynamic Random Access Memory, okay? And the synchronous means it synchronizes with the motherboard. That's when we say, when I said back in motherboards, if you can't find the motherboard speed, look at the native RAM speed, because these all synchronize together. My OBS Studio is having issues. Because it synchronizes together, that's why I said that's how you can find that number. So the current kind of RAM is called SDRAM, or Synchronous Dynamic Random Access Memory, okay? This is the original SDRAM, okay? And it was slow in comparison of what, really? There we go, okay. Of what we have today. Originally, SDRAM had 2 notches in it. And like I said, this is old, but I'm going to show you where the name convention came from. Originally, SDRAM moved at 66 megahertz, 100 megahertz, and it got up to 133 megahertz. And you guys all know from doing your motherboard things, that is really slow compared with what you have today. You guys have motherboards that did 4,000 megahertz of memory speed, right? So SDRAM started way back here. That was the original. When I came here to Trail 13 years ago, that's actually all we had was original SDRAM. Probably got rid of it all 7 or 8 years ago, okay? So that's the original SDRAM, and then it got twice as fast. So the next generation of SDRAM, gonna have issues on it. The next generation of SDRAM was called DDR RAM, or double data rate. And it's DDR SDRAM. It's still SDRAM, it's just called DDR. Some physical characteristics changed. We lost one of the notches. So you could tell easily which kind of memory, because now it only had 1 notch there. And it was called double data rate because if you remember, I said the maximum SDRAM was 133. DDR started at 266 and it went all the way up to 400 megahertz. So it was called double because it originally came out and doubled the speed of RAM with the first stick that it came out with. Okay? After this, the DDR, meaning double, means nothing. Okay? But that's where the term DDR came from, because it was double of the old RAM. But now you guys know we have DDR2, we have DDR3, and we have DDR4. So now the number, it still stood for double data rate, but now it's 2nd generation, 3rd generation, and now we have 4th generation DDR. But it's really not double of anything, right? DDR4 is 10 times faster than SD RAM. So that, just saying, when I want you to know it stands for double data rate, but it's really a misnomer anymore after DDR. The original DDR was called just DDR, and then DDR2 was second generation. Now the double really doesn't mean anything anymore. Does that make sense? Because it kind of doesn't sometimes to people. Well, I thought it was double. Well, it was double. Way back in 2005 when it came out, it was double, but it's not 2005 anymore. Okay, so we had DDR, which doubled the speed of the previous generation, and it gave us a new form factor that went with new CPUs. Okay, and then, for some reason that's not going to work, we got DDR2, and then we got DDR3, and now we have DDR4. And this little chart is in your reading, okay, and it doesn't show everything, but you can see that static or synchronous SD RAM, and it just has SDR here, went to 133. It doesn't even have the 266 that came out with DDR, and it went up, and it's way past this 2,666. Now we know it goes all the way up to 4,000. It's just I couldn't find a better chart than this one that went back and forward. So we've gone through generations of DDR, and as it's gone, the notch has moved. The number of contacts, the physical size of it is exactly the same. If you held them up to each other, as far as the length of a stick of RAM, since we came out with DDR, has stayed exactly the same. Where the notch has changed, so you can't get the wrong one physically in the wrong motherboard. Although I've had a number of people try, and they break their motherboard because they'll just buy one, and I teach you guys you got to put some pressure on it to get it in. But I also say you got to line up the notch first, and people will just go until they've snapped something. Okay, because if it's the wrong one, it's not going to go in. So the notch is moved. You can see actually the notch. You can't see it very well. It's there. Is almost lined up back here where DDR originally was. But the contacts, if you can see how much smaller the contacts are here than here, even though the physical size of it is the same width, there's way more contacts now in DDR4 than there was back in DDR. The little or gold contacts have gotten smaller and smaller and thinner, so there's way more contacts now than there was before. Okay. As I look at this memory, one of the things you may notice is I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sticks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sticks. Why is there 8 physical things on a stick of RAM? Why is that? If I had to guess.
Like 16.
What? You gotta speak up.
I know, but it's 16 and DDR4.
Well, that is a bad example on the DDR4. We'll pretend that one isn't there because we'll talk about why that one's there later. Okay, but really, they all have 8. But why do they have 8?
The package is
The package is sent as
bytes.
bytes, and how many bits are in a byte? 8. So every single time it writes to this as a column and as a row, depending on how many bytes it's writing. And one of them goes here, and one of them goes there, and one of them goes there, and one of them goes there, and one of them goes there. Blah, blah, blah. You get the idea, okay? So as it writes, that's why there are those physical memory modules there. It writes, when it's writing a byte, it writes it across there. And the next one gets written across there too. And it writes in columns and rows of information as it writes in there. And that's going to come up here in a little bit. We talk about column and row latency, or how long it takes to write to those columns and rows. But as we look at this, I just wanted to point out the physical characteristics. Even though they stay the same width, the notch moves, and the number of contacts, the physical contacts, change too. Which is why it goes back to form factor. It has to be the one that goes for your motherboard for it to fit inside your motherboard. I don't know why the next arrow is not working since everything else is working. Okay. The other thing when we talk about physicals is the difference between desktop RAM and laptop RAM. Okay. A desktop stick, and these are SD RAM, and this is DDR, if you can't tell, because it's got 2 notches there and 1 notch there. But the difference between them, this is called a DIMM. The big ones are DIMMs. The little ones are called SODIMMs. So if you're looking for laptop RAM, you have to look for SODIMMs. And if you're looking for desktop RAM, you have to look for DIMMs. Okay? Why do I point that out? Because everyone's going to do a presentation this time on memory for their motherboard. And if you show me a SODIMM, which every year someone does, is it going to work for your desktop?
No.
No. Okay. It will definitely not work for your desktop. SODIMMs are not as fast. How many modules does it have on here? It has 4. How does that work? Well, because it's writing twice to the same module, so even though they're rated the same and rated as fast, SODIMMs are never quite as fast as a DIMM. If they were, why would we make 2 kinds? We just make SODIMMs for desktops too, right? You'd only have 1 kind of RAM. But DIMMs are definitely slightly faster than SODIMMs. So you can see this is just a picture, so you physically see it's roughly half the size of a stick of desktop RAM. I'm not even going to try to do that this time. Okay? So when we talk about RAM speeds, the only thing we've talked about up to this point is that speed in megahertz. We have not brought up one other part of RAM speed other than that. We say our motherboard takes 3000 megahertz DDR4, that's the only number that's ever mattered to you. But every stick of 3000 megahertz DDR4 is not the same. There are other things that impact it. That's just one thing I taught you guys to look about back when we were motherboards, and now we're going to look at the other things. Just like when we look at CPUs the first time, we were only looking at sockets, and then we learned about generations, and we learned about cache. There's way more to it than just that megahertz that many people look at when they're going to buy RAM. RAM is also impacted, and I'm saying impacted because it's not a straight ratio, but it's impacted by the timing involved, which we haven't talked about, we're going to talk about. It's impacted by the architecture. When I talk about architecture, I'm talking about, is it dual channel, is it tri-channel, is it quad channel RAM? The different architectures give a different overall speed. This number doesn't change, okay? Megahertz is the megahertz is the megahertz. Just like on a CPU, the gigahertz was the gigahertz was the gigahertz. But a 3.2 gigahertz CPU is not the same as another 3.2 gigahertz CPU because the number of cores changed, the number of amount of cache changed, all those things changed to make one of them better than the other. Just like in RAM, the megahertz is a set number, but what's its timing? What kind of architecture does it support? And what kind of type is it? We're going to talk about all those new things that impact what makes RAM different, okay? So I just showed a picture down here. There's desktop RAM. If you were to go to Newegg right now, it's going to ask you, are you looking for desktop, laptop, or server memory? These two are very, very similar, but they're not, okay? If you held one up, you could stick one in the other computer. They both are the same physical size, but part of the architecture and types of RAM that goes in one will not work in the other and vice versa, okay? And obviously laptop memory is different in size altogether. You can't physically get that in there. So we're going to learn about these other things in architecture, you know, down here on this one, whatever one I copied. This one said how much capacity it had, what the speed was in megahertz, and then it added these other things that we haven't talked about. This cache latency, this timing, we don't know what that is yet. Voltage doesn't really matter that much, but what kind of channels does it support? Does it support 2, 3, or 4 channels? And those things increase the speed of it. Do I care about what color it is? No, but if I had a clear case, maybe I would. So we're going to learn about some of these new things, okay? So memory speed is definitely impacted, obviously, by the megahertz. When I look at memory, I'm going to go back to this one. I get both the megahertz here and the PC rating. Those are a one-to-one connection. So on this isn't my slide. This is a slide that this and this, it's like saying 3 as to 3 as 3 is to 3. Did I say anything different? No. Okay. So if you rate memory looking at the megahertz versus the PC rating, this number is the same for every 2400. Get what I'm saying? The PC rating is related directly to which stick of RAM. So to say that this determined speed is the same as saying this determined speed because they're a one-to-one ratio between the numbers. And we'll look at some of those. But we don't even measure in nanoseconds anymore. That's old. Okay, really, speed is in megahertz. Okay, and we'll talk about what the PC rating is, but megahertz is the main way that people look at it. Okay, memory speed is not changed by how much memory is installed. System performance will change based on how much memory is installed. Okay, so if I tell you you're putting in memory that's 2400 megahertz, the speed of the RAM makes no difference whether I put in 1 stick, 2 sticks, 3 sticks, or 4 sticks, but the overall performance of the PC itself may change dramatically depending on how much memory and what kind of sticks we put in. Okay. Technology used, when we're talking about that, we're really talking about that dual channel, and there's a whole article in the book that I'm going to have you guys read. Dual channel, tri-channel, and quad channel RAM. What that talks about is that as it's writing, if I have 2 sticks of RAM, and if it doesn't support dual channel, if it's just a stick of RAM in there, then every time it does a cycle, it writes or reads to that stick of RAM as it's going by the stick of RAM. If it's dual channel, as it goes by that stick of RAM, as it's cycling through the bus, if it's dual channel, one will write and one will read, and it effectively increases the speed of the RAM. Okay, and quad channel does that double fold. Okay, so that ability to do, how do I do that? To do dual or quad channel architecture means that it reads and writes not really twice as often, but relatively speaking, kind of twice as fast. So dual channel is good. Dual channel and quad channel only works on a motherboard if the motherboard A supports it, if the memory supports it, and you put it in right. When I look at a motherboard, I didn't pull up a picture, but I'm gonna. When I look at a motherboard, many times we have off colors, and I think I talked about this in motherboards. And what that means is that these are channeled together and that these are channeled together. That's why there's different colors. Which means if I get 2 sticks of 8 gig of RAM and I put them in here and here, I have 16 gig of RAM. And I just wasted the fact that this does dual channel architecture. I have to put them in the same channel. So I have to put them here and here for dual channel to work. They also have to be exactly the same. If I put a 4 in here and a 2 in here, it's not dual channel. It has to be the exact same size of memory, and generally I try to buy the exact same make, model, everything if I want to get dual channel to work. Now, I could have different sticks here than here. I could have a 4 and a 4 and an 8 and an 8, and these will work as dual channel and these will work as dual channel. But you can't mix them in the same thing. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So that's really, and there's a whole article that you're going to read today and answer a couple questions, but that's what that memory technology is talking about, is what kind of extra stuff that it has. And then CL rating stands for CAS latency, and that goes back to this picture. All on the, well, I'm going to go back one more, but as I look at this, this is called the timing of that stick of RAM, okay? And this is saying right here, the CAS latency is the first number. It's saying it takes 16 cycles of the motherboard to write the whole column of data. So it can't do it when we're talking about motherboards that are going at 4,000 megahertz. If we remember, that's 4,000 million cycles per second. It can't go by that memory and write it that fast. It's going to take 16 trips at that speed, which is still very, very minute if we did the math, right? But it's going to take 16 trips around the motherboard of the data before it writes that whole column of data in that RAM. So would it be a faster stick of RAM if this number is higher or lower? Lower, okay? That's one of those ones that when we look at RAM, if I looked at 2 sticks of DDR4 2400 and one of these said 15 and one of them said 16, the one that said 15 is faster because it's going to take less cycles. And you may say, oh, it's only one different, Mr. Poole. Okay, but it's doing it millions of times a second, and those ones will add up. Okay? Are the two of them going to notice a 5-minute difference in boot time because of one difference in the cast latency? No. But might he be back in the battle after the respawn 2 seconds before her and shoot her before she even knows what happens? I don't know. I don't know how fast that happens. Anybody get Battlefront 2 for Christmas? So, what?
It's all microtransactions.
So,
Okay.
anyway. So, not a huge difference, but definitely a difference. And many times, people just look at this number and don't even realize they could have bought something faster for the same price because they don't even know what this number means, okay? So, you can see their cast latency is 16, time is 16 because the first number in timing is the cast latency. So the lower the number, the better. And that goes back to whatever picture I had. Maybe I haven't had that yet. That it's writing to all these at the same time and how many trips around the motherboard does it take. Now, if we went and looked at DDR memory, you're going to see cast latencies as low as 5 and 4. And up in DDR4, they're going to be up in 15s and 16s. Why would it take more trips with newer memory than it did with the old memory? What? No, it's because this is going crazy faster, right? This is going to 4,000 megahertz versus 400. So even though it only took 4 trips at 400 versus 15 trips at 4,000, this one's still way faster. Okay, so it's not a direct number. You can't just say cast latency is better. I'm buying DDR for my computer because it was only 4, right? Because it's 4 at 400, and if we did the math, this number is way slower than 15 at 4,000. If we're dividing out, if we were to divide out the time in nanoseconds, which is what we'd end up with, this one is still way faster than this, even though the cast latency. So my point is, when we look at that number, we have to compare oranges to oranges. If I'm not looking at the same speed, then I can't compare the cast latency. Does that make sense? Because if it's going, or if the motherboard is transmitting if I'm looking there, okay, DDR4, the fastest one we have is 4,000, right? Is that the fastest DDR4 anybody had for their motherboard that supported? Nobody remembers back that far. It's ancient data. Okay, we'll go to Newegg, and I'll just show you. Okay, so if we were to go to Newegg memory. Go straight to desktop memory. If I was to look over here, look, okay, it's even slower. Look, DDR4 on their chart goes up to 4,600 megahertz, and it goes down to 2,133. Okay, so if here, switch pins. Maybe it's the pen, or maybe I should have. So 4,600 versus, what did I say, 2333? 2133. Okay, so would the cast latency on this make sense if this said this one was 16 and this one was 15? Is that worse that it took one more trip around the motherboard when it's going over twice as fast around the motherboard? That's what I'm saying. That cast latency, even though that one's slower, isn't a direct comparison because so see what I'm saying? You have to compare oranges to oranges. When you look at cast latency, if you're not looking at the same speed of RAM, the number isn't a comparison.
So divide it.
But you could do that. You could go through and divide it out and figure out the speed in nanoseconds. And the article that you're going to read talks about how to do that. Okay, you could, but you just don't compare the numbers with each other right away. Okay, so if I was to go down here, and I'm going to pick out, let's see, are these both the same speed? DDR4 3000. Actually, we'll look at two different ones. So this one is DDR4 3000, and its latency is 15. This one is DDR4 2400, and you can see the latency is slightly slower. So this one is way better than this one, because I have a lower latency with a faster speed, right? So this one takes another trip around the motherboard, and the motherboard's going slower. So that's a good indication that this isn't a little bit better memory. It's a lot better memory, because it's got a lower CL and a higher megahertz speed. Mud? Okay, and the last thing is whether it's got error correcting code or parity, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. Okay, but that's the last thing that affects your memory speed, and this is really talking about whether it's server or desktop RAM, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Okay, so when it comes to comparing RAM, this is not my chart. It says faster if there's more malarkey. The RAM's not faster if there's more. The system can be faster if there is more. The newer technology, DDR, is better than all the stuff that doesn't even exist anymore. We don't write in nanoseconds, but faster megahertz, higher PC ratings, which are, like I already said, it's the same thing. And then a lower CL or RL. CL stands for the column latency, and RL stands for the row latency. We only look at one of those numbers ever, and usually it's the column latency. Okay? So, there are different generations of RAM. We talked about the physical aspects of RAM. We talked generally about the speeds and the basic architecture. There are 4 sections of the RAM book that I want you to read this morning, right there. And then I want you to go through the questions in it's a journal there as well. So you should see the book now. As you're reading through the first 4 sections of the book, make sure you pick up the stash. If you pick up the stash, you'll see that come out of gray, and you'll be able to answer the questions. Okay? The whole point of going through and doing the reading and looking through this, basically I'm introducing you, then you're going to do the reading, and you're going to do the journal, and then we're going to talk about it before we go on to the next section. I'm trying to break it up into smaller sections instead of doing it like I used to, which is read the book and then we'll move on with the project. Because I'm not gone! So,
Except when you're going to the conference.
that's in February.
But at all, like no more like weeks.
No.
Are you
Are
retired?
we gonna have a project while you're gone in February?
Yeah, of course
Well,
you
not from school, but from
Oh,
Maybe.
I hate
I
when
may
you
only
go
be
with
gone one
projects
day,
and
though.
leave.
See, I'm gone 3 days.
You're still
So
Air
it's
Force.
either 2 days for you or 1 day, depending on the brown, orange day falling schedule.
1 day.
Yes. Is your
Make it
soul
all-
still part of the government,
So-
or are you free finally?
I am retired, although they want me to come back January 26th to do a retirement ceremony, since they forgot to do my ceremony when I was actually there.
They didn't forget it.
I'm trying to decide, well, they're
Like,
not making it a big
right,
thing.
cool,
Do
who's that?
I want a flag folding? Do I want a chaplain to come and do an invocation?
Gosh, you're not
They're
dying.
like, I know, they're doing this big, huge thing, or they want to, and I haven't decided whether I want to do it.
Flag folding.
Because they're making themselves feel better because they forgot, right? They're trying to do it, they're trying to overdo it because they feel like
Just
Crap.
picture of
crap
the
for
wall.
forgetting entirely. I don't want to go back. It's a month and a half after I retired. You missed it. Yes, you're jerks.
Yes.
Just send
Just ask for
send a
something.
fruit basket.
Yeah.
With it.
Just ask them taking a picture of your face in the server.